1941. Nuclear warfare was deceiving. Neutral laws, which were published from 1935 to 1937, forbid trading or credit to any warring nation. Neutrality was also the initial American response to the outbreak of the World War II in Europe in 1939. After the crushing defeat of France and the air war against Britain in 1940, the United States abandoned their politics of neutrality and joined Canada into a defense alliance to protect the nations in the Western Hemisphere. The Congress voted for rearmament, and in early 1941, President Theodore Roosevelt transferred arms and equipment, mostly to Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. The 1940s presidential elections ended in another majority for Roosevelt. For the first time in U.S. history, a president was elected to a third term of office. On December 7, 1941, Japan started bombing Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The next day, America declared war to Japan, and another 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war to the USA. The nation started with mobilization its people and its industrial capacity. By the end of 1943, approximately 65 million men and women were in uniforms or in war-related occupations. The Western Allies decided that their necessary military effort were to be concentrated on Europe. The Pacific area was to be secondary objective. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in the Normandy, France. On August 25, Paris was liberated, and in February and March 1945, troops advanced into Germany, and on May 8, Germany surrendered. Nevertheless, the war in the Pacific area continued. On August 6, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 92,000 people died and 37,000 were injured. 2 days later, another bomb destroyed Nagasaki and killed over 60,000 people. Because of that, Emperor Hirohito formally surrendered on September 2, 1945. The war was over. 1947, Cold Times. After Harry Truman was elected for president, he changed the relations to the Soviet Union. He established a politic of anti-communism, which was based on the American economic superiority and, until July 1945, of the monopoly on nuclear weapons. Their concept was a free Europe under leadership by the USA. In the sequel, there were several problems and misunderstandings, which determined the relationship between the USA and the USSR. In 1949, China changed the political system into communism, and the USSR tested their first atomic bomb. The arms race ended in a draw. The relationship freezed. 1962, world on the brink of ruin. As a result of the Cold War, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, planned to install medium-range missile on Cuba. President John F. Kennedy recognized the risk for the USA and the members of the NATO alliance. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy ordered the Soviet leaders to withdraw the missiles. Besides, he imposed a sea blockade to prevent continued arms supplies. The conflict came to a head, and the world was near to a nuclear world war. After long negotiations, the Soviet Union decided to remove the weapons from Cuba. In return, the USA took away their missiles pointed at Moscow from Turkey. Officially, the conflict ended with a signing from Washington and Moscow, which was sent to the Secretary-General of the UN. 1963, death of a statesman. In autumn 1963, J.F. Kennedy started his election campaign. On November 22, Kennedy was driven through Dallas, Texas, when deadly rounds in head and neck killed him. Lee Harvey Oswald, the presumed murderer, was also shot by Jack Ruby 2 days later. In 1964, the fact-finding committee came to the result that Oswald must be the only offender. Nevertheless, a second committee in 1979 discovered that Kennedy was murdered by at least 2 sharpshooters. They concluded that President Kennedy fell victim to constipation. The committee cast suspicion on the CIA, the FBI, the Mafia, and Fidel Castro. 1965, A Love and Peace Against War. In 1955, the USA relieved France as the protecting power in South Vietnam. with help from the Americans, and Ngo Dinh Diem was able to install a dictatorship, which persecuted any opposition. Diem canceled the elections, which were planned for 1956. The Viet Cong, which were supported by North Vietnam, began to fight against the dictator and American installations. In 1960, the South established an own army, which depended on the North. Because of increasing attacks from the Viet Cong, the USA strengthened their pact with the South. In 1961, President Kennedy reinforced the U.S. Army in Vietnam. In 1963, over 16,000 soldiers were stationed. The Diem regime was put increasing under pressure by the Viet Cong, which took a large area under their control. On November 1, 1963, after a putsch, Diem was deprived of his power and executed. But in August 1964, the war escalated because of the Tonkin incident. On August 2 and 4, military torpedo boats from the North attacked two U.S. destroyers. President Lyndon B. Johnson was authorized to lead the troops against North Vietnam by the Congress. In February 1965, the USA began to bomb strategically important targets in North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Until 1968, the U.S. Army took 543,000 men to Vietnam. The USA got support from Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and other allies. In spite of numeral ratio and military superiority, U.S. Army was unable to get the war to a decision. With global bombards with napalm and defoliant Agent Orange, the Americans tried to change the power. The economy and infrastructure from the North was destroyed. At this time, North Vietnam depended on military support from the USSR and China. In November 1967, the Pentagon published the number of killed soldiers with 15,058 and 109,527 injured Army members. The financial costs ran up to $25 billion, and because of that, more and more people demonstrated against this war in the USA. In January 1968, the Viet Cong started a large-scale attack against many South Vietnamese towns. After that offensive, and the publication of massacre on the civilians by chemical weapons, the protests in the USA and the whole world became louder. On March 31, President Johnson declared the bombings for concluded. The USA and North Vietnam discussed about a peace treaty in Paris on May 13, 1968. But the negotiation was broke off and the South went on fighting. In 1969, the new President Richard Nixon wanted to end the military mission in Vietnam. Nevertheless, the Viet Cong demanded of the U.S. government the immediate and complete withdrawal of the American troops. Moreover, the Americans wanted to prevent support from Laos and Cambodia. Therefore, they bombarded Laos and Cambodia in 1970 and 1971. These attacks were ostracized by the world and intensified the anti-war protests in the whole world. After endless discussions and a going on of the war, President Nixon declared the ceasefire on January 23, 1973. This war killed over 2 million Vietnamese, 12 million people lost their home. Over 157,000 U.S. soldiers were killed and 150,000 men injured. 1968, peacefully man died by force. In 1955, the Court of Justice declared the segregation on public schools for unlawful, which expanded on all sectors of public life. So, Martin Luther King was requested to lead a boycott of the public bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. As a result of these protests, which lasted 381 days, Luther King was arrested, became several threatening letters, and his house was blasted. After the protest, each kind of race discriminations in public transportation stopped at once. In 1968, Martin Luther King planned to lead a Poor People's March to Washington because wanted to demonstrate against the war in Vietnam. But on April 4th, Luther King was shot by James Earl Ray in Memphis, Tennessee. For 1983, every third Monday on January was declared for nation holiday. The house where he was born and his grave belonged to the National Monuments of the USA. 1969. The eagle has landed. The famous flight of Apollo 11 began on July 16, 1969. After getting into orbit, Edwin E. Aldrin and Neil Armstrong switched to the lunar module. Michael Collins was left in the command module. In July 20th, they landed the module on the moon near the Mare Tranquillitatis area. A few hours later, Armstrong went down a ladder and set his foot on the moon. On July 21st, for days after liftoff, at 3:56 a.m. humankind was able to bring the first human beings to the moon. After Aldrin got out, they went for a walk. In 2 hours, they collected 21-kilogram minerals, took pictures and realized some experiments. Via satellite, millions of people watched the sensation. Without a hitch, the astronauts flew back to Earth. On July 24th, they splashed down in the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii. 1973. Procedure against President. On June 17, 1972. -1 men were arrested because they broke into offices in the Watergate apartments in Washington, which belonged to George McGovern, the candidate for president elections of the Democratic Party. The men planned to install bugging systems by order of President Nixon's election committee. In the course of the preliminary proceedings, Nixon was accused of accomplishment in March 1974. The Congress instituted an impeachment against the president. In the sequel of the investigation, it became known that Nixon ordered the FBI to dismiss the case. That means that he wanted to disguise the scandal. To anticipate the impeachment, Nixon resigned his post as the first president of the USA. The Watergate affair produced a breach of trust inside the American society.